Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening.
Yes, this program was in response to the avalanche of mail that we received after our program on A Little Rebellion. Now and then, Jefferson's response first to Shays Rebellion in 1786, then the Great French Revolution in 1789, and projecting forward to what he might have wanted to say about the insurrection at the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021.
There was so much mail, and it was all directed at that program, which was program number 1431, titled A Little Rebellion. It's probably still up at the website at jeffersonhour.com or on your favorite podcast platform. If you go to jeffersonhour.com, you can look for it there, and you can support the show, which we so appreciate, by clicking on the donate button. We need it, and we so appreciate it. And I really enjoyed this conversation this week, mostly because it was such great questions from listeners. There's a bunch that we didn't get to. We could have spent another hour.
The thing about it is that Jefferson is unique among the founding fathers. So Shays Rebellion was an agrarian rebellion in western Massachusetts because of economic dislocations that came after the Revolutionary War, and the farmers of the West were not well enough represented in the state legislature at Springfield, and when they couldn't get any redress of their honest and significant grievances, they upped the ante and eventually shut down some farm auctions and stopped some foreclosures and tarred and feathered a few people and so on. And this horrified the American establishment. It horrified Abigail and John Adams, who thought that it was the coming of pandemonium and the apocalypse. And it horrified James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. And the three of them sort of put together the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which in large part was meant to create a strong enough central government to deal with insurrections of that sort. And so of all the founding fathers, Jefferson is really the only one. Keep in mind he's in Paris, but he's the only one to say, this isn't such a bad thing, that I think we need to be pretty patient with these farmer rebels, that they remind us of what liberty is about. And yes, they're ignorant and misguided, but that doesn't mean that we just shut them down. And he said something really interesting along those lines, David. He said, very often when we put down an insurrection, we install and embed the very tyrannies that the insurrection rose to address. In other words, we overreact in crushing a rebellion, and in doing so, we create the very state power, the state apparatus that the rebels were so frightened of in the first place. And so Jefferson is very unusual in this regard, and not just perplexing to the founding fathers, perplexing to the rest of us. I wrestle with this all the time. How could Jefferson defend the reign of terror in France? Well, he said it's a kind of a measure of how bad things were for so long, that when the people of France finally rose up and did something about it, they weren't very polite. They had some rage to get off their shoulders. They were wanting to dispossess themselves of this bile, this frustration that they had had for centuries about bad governance and bad social structures in France. And so he saw this somehow as something that we need to take seriously. And I think that's the point, that instead of saying, oh, how could this have happened at the U.S. Capitol? Of course we're going to say that. But instead of lingering there, he wants to say, what does this signify? What can we learn? What's the source of the rage? Is there a way that we can address this and heal as a country, or agree on a consensus of what happened in the 2020 election, or prepare ourselves for the 2024 election so that similar anxieties and frustrations are not the result of it? And so I'm with him there. I'm with him that, and I think you are too, that the right focus is not condemnation. That's easy. The right focus is trying to understand what's really at stake here and how we got to this point, and even more importantly, how we can work our way honestly out of it.
As I said, there was a number of letters we didn't get to this week, including a letter from Nathan Hepner, who's written us before.
He's my friend.
We're going to have to save for, they could turn into an entire conversation, a show-length conversation. There's one from Steve Worcester that I'm going to, at the risk of letting this podcast intro go too long, I'm going to present to you. And his is, I would think that if one is trying to figure Mr. Jefferson's reaction to the storming of the Capitol, one would look at his reaction to Burr's treason as well as to Shays Rebellion. He was not always ready to forgive.
Well, yeah, of course, when it was his own administration, and when Jefferson was felt that his own enlightened approach to governance was being questioned by a ruffian like his vice president Aaron Burr, then his famous thin skin got thinner than usual, and he condemned Burr and said he was guilty beyond any question, and tried to do everything he could to make sure that Burr would be convicted of treason in the court at Richmond, which was presided over by Jefferson's nemesis and distant cousin, Chief Justice John Marshall. Of course, I mean, it needed be said, we are all hypocrites. Almost everyone is a hypocrite at some level in their life. So out of power, Jefferson is against constitutional overreach. In power, he buys the Louisiana Territory.
Steve goes on to say, the events of January 6th are more serious than you seem to think. And he talks about the storming of the Capitol, how they were out to possibly kill congressmen and decapitate the government, and that if that had happened, we'd have had military law to restore order, at least in D.C. That seems to be the thinking of many of those inside the Capitol with guns. One would think this would worry Jefferson much more than Shays Rebellion did.
Well, yes, when you attack the government itself, that's a more significant thing. You know, David, I'm just surprised we don't know enough yet about this. We need to be agnostic and cautious until we know more. But, you know, if they had gone in with guns and explosive devices and hatchets and so on, you know, it seems like they could have gotten to some of those members of Congress. That it was sort of an assault on the Capitol light, L-I-T-E, that there was more taking of selfies than there was a determined effort to get at these people. I don't know enough about this, and so I hope...
Steve writes, and he says, we should not write this off as a demonstration that got out of hand. Note that Shay rebelled. He asked the government to leave him alone. The storming of the Capitol was an attempt to take over the government, to deny the winner of an election in his place. In my humble opinion, Jefferson was much more sympathetic to the former than the latter.
Of course. But see, the people who made that assault on January 6th were not faking it when they said the election was stolen. They believed and believe it. And so that's where the rub comes. How do we convince them? You would have thought 60-some court cases would be enough, and recounts in Georgia, and state legislators certifying the election, including in every one of these cases, Republican election officials and Republican-dominated legislatures. So you would think, well, if that doesn't convince you, what would convince you? It's not as if it's like we don't know. It's just all vague and ambiguous, and there's no way to tell. I mean, the Trump people put together dozens, scores of court tests, and those court tests uniformly were thrown out. And in several instances, the judges rebuked the Trump legal teams for their frivolousness, for wasting court time, for having no basis, having no evidence. It seems clear that we had a vetting process. You know, if it were Democrat election officials in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, etc., who said no irregularities here, as far as I can tell, that would be worth feeling a little bit of skepticism towards. But they were Republican election officials, and not only Republican election officials, but ones that were being browbeaten not only by Trump forces, but by Donald Trump himself, as in the famous call he made to Georgia. So, you know, it seems like, well, what's it going to take? What's it going to take? That's why I'm for a blue ribbon nonpartisan commission. Let's go ahead and spend $30 or $40 million on this. Let's track down every possible allegation, take them all seriously, wrestle them to the ground, write a report to the American people, and try to assess how many fraudulent votes actually occurred. Was it 10? Was it 10 times 100? Was it 10,000? Was it 500,000? How many irregular votes were there in the 2020 election? Would any of that have made a difference? And more important than all of that, how can we shore up the system so that something like this doesn't happen again. And when the history is written about this 1,000 years from now or 500 years from now, they're going to say most of what was fuel for conspiracy thinking and the notion that the election was stolen actually is the result of the pandemic of COVID-19, which disrupted the normal flow of the voting process in the country and created just enough sort of last-second emergency situations in deciding how to get in all the votes and count them all, that it was ripe ground for those who willfully seek conspiracy and willfully choose not to accept the results. I think that the pandemic is a bigger factor than we have given credit to, and that's more reason to figure out how to avoid this in the future. I agree with this letter, by the way. I think everything that he said is correct, and I am afraid that I have been too nonchalant about what happened on January 6th. I think it's easy for someone living hundreds and hundreds of miles from that epicenter to look on it as sort of a comic buffoon moment or a moment of vandalism, when in fact it could have been much, much, much graver.
Thanks to Steve Worcester for that letter, and I apologize for the length of this podcast intro, but that's a pretty good setup for the tone of this week's conversation. The show is Rebellion Revisited. And with that, sir?
Yes, sir. Go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. There's a lot there, including the online courses that I'm teaching. And the one that's in process now is on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the making of the atomic bomb. Soon, Hamlet, 4 sessions on Hamlet. I could not be more thrilled to be teaching an online course about what I regard as the greatest single product in English literature, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and I'll prove to you that it's much easier to come to terms with than you might have thought from your high school or early college experience. And after that, the Great Plains, the books, the literature of the Great Plains, including Willa Cather's magnificent My Antonia, O.E. Rollvog's Giants in the Earth, Kent Harroff's more recent Plain Song, and a diary by a woman named Anne Marie Lowe from Fessenden, North Dakota, Anne Marie Lowe's Dust Bowl Diary, which is just a wonderful short account of what it was like to live here during the darkest decade of Great Plains life. So all of that and much more. The summer trips are full, but Cuba in the spring. And then John Steinbeck in March. John Steinbeck's California with none other than a friend, Russ Eagle of North Carolina.
And with that,
let us go to the program. And thanks to everyone who wrote to us. And please continue to let us know what you think of all the programs that we do. The more we hear from you, the happier we are. Let's listen to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. And good day to you, citizen.
Good day to you, David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. It's a great day in North Dakota. You know, it's early March when we are recording this program, and yesterday it was 59 degrees. It felt like the middle of August up here on the northern Great Plains.
Indeed it did. A little odd, but nice to hear those birds singing and be able to walk outside without that cold blast in your face. Several weeks ago, sir, we had a conversation with President Jefferson about Shays Rebellion, and it generated a great deal of response from our listeners. And this week, I'd like to present some of those letters to you for your response. But before I do that, I'd like to touch on a couple of other items. And first would be your online Constitution course, which I had the pleasure to attend recently. I snuck in as an attendee at your invitation, and it was just thoroughly enjoyable. You had said if I could pop in for a few minutes, and I ended up staying for the entire conversation.
Well, the reason I asked you is that there's widespread belief that you don't exist, that you're either a bot of some sort, maybe a Russian collusion bot, or that I'm actually throwing my voice and playing both parts. And so people always ask me, what about this David Swenson? What sort of a person is he? What are his passions? Does he even exist? Why doesn't he go on your cultural tours? When can we ever meet him? And so on. And I always say, you know, he's a very busy man and something of a shy man, something of an introvert. But, you know, I promise you that he does exist. And so then I invited you onto the The constitutional online course that I was teaching, it's over now, but we're going to be redoing it again in the fall. It's a very, very interesting and successful online public humanities course. No exams, no papers to write, no grades. But people are really hungry, David, for, as you saw when you made your cameo appearance, although some believed you were a body double, but I won't go down that path. But when you made your appearance, you saw the commitment people have to talk about this idea, like, where are we? And I should just say, as a matter of collateral interest, that yesterday I was able to interview a Yale law professor named Jack Balkin about his book on the cycles of constitutional time. And I won't go into great detail, but I asked him, did we have a constitutional crisis, or is it what he likes to call constitutional rot? Constitutional rot is not conceding the election or going to the inauguration of your successor, but constitutional crisis is when the guardrails actually break down. And when I asked him this question, Professor Balkin said, well, it did come to a constitutional crisis finally on January 6th, that when a losing candidate and his partisans try to use violence to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, that's not rot, that's an actual constitutional crisis. And then I said to him, is it over? Have we been through that now and things begin to calm down? He said, well, the next 2 or 3 months are amongst the most important in modern American history. We may have more violence, more riots, more insurrection. We may reach a point where the 70-some million people who voted passionately for President Trump simply refused to concede that he lost the election. And at that point, you're essentially a broken country, not a republic, but a broken country. And he said these next weeks are exceedingly important. And so he was unwilling to predict what's going to happen, although he said it's likely that there will be more violence before this moment, this period in our extraordinary history is over. So that Constitution course has been of extraordinary importance to me, and I just love doing it. I'm on now to another one on J. Robert Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb, but we'll be circling back to the Constitution in the fall. And my students were so glad to see you there, and you made some comments which they really liked. They see you as the calming voice of the Thomas Jefferson hour.
Well, I take that with a grain of salt and also a lot of pleasure. But it really was interesting. It made me wish I had been involved in some of the earlier sessions rather than just the final wrap up.
Well, you're always welcome to come, of course, and people like to hear your voice, partly because they like to hear your voice, but they also like to hear your views of things. They've come to trust you as sort of their representative.
Well, not everyone, but we'll get to that later.
But go ahead.
The one that really intrigued me was your upcoming one on Hamlet, which, it's been decades since I've read Hamlet, so far in my past that I barely remember any of it. But that one sounds really intriguing to me.
Yeah, so I'm doing this one on J. Robert Oppenheimer. That'll be followed by 4 weeks on Hamlet, which is, in my view, the greatest single piece of English literature, a piece of literature that revolutionized my life, actually, back in 1974. And then after that, there'll be one on Great Plains literature, including Willa Cather and O.E. Rolvog and Kent Heroff, the great Colorado novelist, whose book on the Great Plains called Plain Song is one of the best things written in the last 50 years about the Great Plains of America. So this is fun. This is sort of the pandemic reboot of my life. Zoom, I didn't even know existed 18 months ago, and now it's something that I use virtually every single day of my life. So, yes, Hamlet. And let me just make the case for Hamlet. Not that has much to do with Jefferson.
Well, Jefferson never read Hamlet, but he did read some Shakespeare. Isn't that right?
He mentions Macbeth and King Lear, and I'm sure he read Hamlet. I'm sure he saw Hamlet. He was a frequenter of theater in Williamsburg, and then when he was in London briefly with John Adams. So I'm guessing he certainly knew Hamlet. I doubt that Jefferson would have much sympathy for Hamlet. Hamlet is as Laurence Olivier famously put it in his 1940s edition of the play, that Hamlet was a man who could not make up his mind. And Jefferson was the kind of person who can always make up his mind. And he was skeptical about metaphysics, skeptical about theorizing and philosophizing and agonizing over the meaning of existence. Jefferson's view was, get out, plant something in the garden, take a long walk, write a letter, read a book, write a book, contribute to your society. And the more you actually do something, the less ennui and self-introspection you'll be engaged in. And remember, he told his daughter, Martha, determined never to be idle. Somebody who is never idle will never complain of a want of time. And he said that idleness creates ennui, and ennui, melancholia. And the people that are depressed or self-destructive are usually people who aren't just doing enough. Now, that's a pretty lame response from Jefferson.
I remember you talking about that letter and kind of admonishing Jefferson for being so tough on his daughter.
Well, he was tough. He said, if you want my love, you will learn to read Livy in Latin and Don Quixote in Spanish. If I tried that with my daughter, I would get a never call this number again message.
I kind of doubt that.
But Hamlet is the greatest thing. So, I mean, I must say, I am thrilled because I don't know if people know this, and maybe it doesn't matter, but my original interest in life was English Renaissance literature. History is just something that happened to me when I was making other plans. I'm just loving going back to John Donne and Shakespeare and Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney and John Milton. But more than that, David, to help people understand how to read Shakespeare. You know, so many people are scared of Shakespeare, intimidated, but I am able to show people that it's way less formidable and intimidating than it seems. And I have a method that helps people make sense of Shakespeare in a way that really opens a door. And frequently people will leave a Shakespeare retreat, say at Lochsaw Lodge or wherever, and say, suddenly, I'm reading a lot of Shakespeare and I'm watching on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever it is, Shakespeare productions, of which there are an enormous number of outstanding recent Shakespeare productions by the RSC and the BBC and other entities. And so in some sense, we're living in the great age of Shakespeare. He's more accessible today, thanks to the internet, thanks to excellent commentaries, and thanks to the spectacular film adaptations that are being made. He's more accessible today probably than at any time except 1603.
But there's no written record of Jefferson mentioning anything by Shakespeare, or is there?
Well, yes, he mentions Macbeth and King Lear. He says you can learn more about good government and tyranny by reading Macbeth than by many of the tomes that you might want to examine in political theory. And he says you can learn more about filial responsibility by reading King Lear. In other words, he held a very common 18th century view that literature should have a moral. Literature should help guide you in responsible human behavior.
We need to take a short break, Clay. I have one quick question for you. It comes from Barrett Freelander. It's about the TR Library, the Theodore Roosevelt Library, and he wonders if you could report on its status.
Right, so there are two entities, the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Jenkinson State University in western North Dakota, and I helped to create that, and we're going to do our 17th annual Public Humanities Symposium on September 23rd through 25th, so you should all come. And then there's the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is a huge undertaking. So we're sort of sister entities. Our work at the TR Center is to digitize all of Roosevelt's papers. We will become the first comprehensive digital presidential library. Think of that. And then the TR Presidential Library has much more ambitious plans to be a convening center and to get people out into the Badlands and to explore and commemorate the life of the 26th president in a much fuller, more generously funded manner in a spectacular building, the ground for which will be broken probably next year or the year after. But that's out in Medora. Our work is a much simpler sort of thing. We do an annual symposium. We do publications and exhibits. I'm working now on one on Edward S. Curtis and Theodore Roosevelt. Curtis was the great photographer of Native American subjects. And then We do the annual symposium, and this year it will be on Roosevelt in the West, not the Badlands West, but the Big West, and it's on the 23rd, 24th, and 25th of September, 2021. So everyone should make their way to the plains of North Dakota and the Badlands, and we will entertain you royally and educate you in a way that I think you will very much find satisfying.
Very good, sir. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. And now, during this week's show, I want to present to you, Clay, a number of letters that we got from listeners about a show we did a couple weeks ago. It was called A Little Rebellion, and we got a lot of correspondence about that show.
I'm still anxious about that program. You saw when we did it how on edge I was, because essentially Jefferson, I think, would look tolerantly and maybe even generously on the sorts of disruptions that we've been living through over the past couple of months. And that troubles me. First of all, I hate to project him forward. Who knows what he would say about what happened on January 6th. But there is this streak in Jefferson of saying we should never overreact to insurrection or rebellion. And he praised Daniel Shays' Rebellion in 1786 and said this is actually healthy for the American Republic. And he praised the French Revolution and defended it, including the Reign of Terror, and said those wild things like the Tree of Liberty needs to be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And so there's this streak in Jefferson, and it's hard to know quite what to make of it. And whenever something happens like what happened on January 6th, I can tell you that the people that were involved were not thugs, at least not in their own mind. They were patriots. And so trying to sort this out in a responsible way from the perspective of history and the humanities is very, very difficult. And I was very nervous doing that program, but you and I both felt that it was important. So let's hear what some of the people had to think about it.
Well, I'll start with a letter from Philip Rosie. And it's a fairly lengthy letter, but I'm going to read most of it. It starts, I am writing in response to a fabulous show, thank you very much, sir, that recently aired titled A Little Rebellion. In the show, Clay mentioned he had been dreading this program and would much prefer to remain on topics like Jefferson's love of wine or gardening. While learning about Jefferson's eccentricities is delightful, I would like to highlight the importance of your shows that tackle difficult issues like current politics, race, etc. For context, I began listening to the Jefferson Hour after a long deployment with the U.S. Navy. On the ship, I found to my chagrin that the only news media available were standard cable networks. I am an NPR man myself, so you can imagine the shock and revulsion I felt being constantly bombarded by the sheer, naked partisanship and pundit bashing that permeates the majority of our news outlets. Then returning home, tired and bitter with the discourse of our nation, I stumbled upon a radio edition of the Four Scholars episode, one of my favorites to this day. I was so enchanted with the purely historical analysis and context it provided, free of bias, and drank it up like a starving plant during a long-awaited rainstorm. Since then, I have become a club member and anxiously await every episode. So that's a lot of thank yous to us and a lot of nice things said. But I'm going to continue with the last paragraph. I understand why these topics can be distasteful to you, Clay. I really do. So please allow me to express my gratitude for choosing to tackle them anyway. In today's political climate, our humanities scholars must weigh in, and with fervor, albeit perhaps reluctant fervor. I can think of no other perspective that has any chance of saving our great, if perhaps no longer enlightened nation, than that of those who have spent their lives studying the movement that helped make America come to be in the first place. Please continue to do what you do, and please continue to tackle these hard issues. To paraphrase the words of another listener, your words matter. Again, that's from Philip Rosie, and you talking in the beginning of this conversation about your reluctance to tackle this subject. I thought that was an appropriate place to start. Maybe a bit self-serving, but an appropriate place to start.
Well, I appreciate it, of course, and I agree with him that NPR is extraordinary. We have now this silo system of Fox and MSNBC and so on. NPR used to be regarded as a leftist approach to public life, to the news and so on. And in fact, in some circles back in the 1980s, it was called Radio Free Nicaragua because of its concerns about America's incursion into that sovereign nation in Central America. But the fact is that NPR and PBS are extraordinarily fair-minded. They bend over backwards to be centrist. They do more long-form things. They give people more than just an 8-second soundbite. They let people speak in complete paragraphs at times. There is a whimsicality and a curiosity and a commitment to integrity in NPR that I find truly remarkable. And I think that if we had nothing but NPR and PBS, we would be an infinitely better nation than we currently are. And I think that people who are reluctant for whatever reason to listen to NPR or PBS are making a mistake. I think that this is what civil discourse should be. And I think that, frankly, that NPR is more Jeffersonian than almost anything you can watch on 24-hour cable, and more consistently thoughtful, evidence-based, and fair-minded. So I certainly agree with Philip Rosie about that. And I do think that the value of our program, if it has value, is that we carefully examine these extraordinary questions that are rocking the world of our time. We had to make a choice long, long ago about whether the Jefferson Hour should be purely confined between April 13th, 1743 and July 4th, 1826, to stay within the guardrails, let's call them, of Jefferson's actual biological life. But I don't think that's a wise approach. I think people are hungry, in some cases aching, to hear civil discourse about important questions and to use history as a lens through which to examine the things that puzzle us and confuse us and trouble us so greatly in our own time. And so I know that it's a gamble to speculate about how Jefferson might have seen something he didn't actually live to see. And we know that Jefferson would have changed with the course of American history. But I do think that our method, whether people approve of it or not, is carefully to project Jefferson forward. He was, after all, a visionary, and to try to use him as a clarifying lens for the confusions of our own time. So I so appreciate that. I'll bet you have in your arsenal there, though, a counter letter that says you two knuckleheads should stay out of current events.
I actually have one that says I'm the knucklehead, but we'll get to that. The first letter that came in after that program was from Jeff Ishii, who signs his letter as a Virginia farm broadcaster. And it was very short. He just said, "Best episode ever. Thank you both for all you do." And I wanted to include it mostly because I was intrigued by this Virginia farm broadcaster. And I looked it up, and it turns out this guy has a program, a website, On the Farm Radio, and they have like 5 million listeners and 430,000 subscribed farming operations. And I went and checked out his website, and he does these 1-minute broadcasts updating farmers, and it's just great. In your answer to this last email, you said you thought NPR was very Jeffersonian. This guy is very Jeffersonian. I wonder if Jefferson would actually approve of NPR, though. There is some government support for it. He probably wouldn't. He wouldn't like that, would he?
Yes, I think that would be an issue. Although if you look at the history of NPR, that it has essentially been weaned of government support. That it has found all sorts of ways to support itself by listeners like you, as it likes to say, that there's a voluntary tax that we pay. In other words, I don't have to contribute to NPR.
But you do.
But I do, and I do it as a voluntary thing. So someone who doesn't like that sort of thing.
So do I.
And so this is a really wonderful funding mechanism that has been set up. In the early days, NPR stations depended heavily on government support, but these days, not much. And I think that's wholly positive, because I think I think Jefferson would agree with what you're concerned, that it's wrong-headed to say every American must support through his tax or her tax money X. Yes, we must support the Department of Defense because that's what a government must do. We must support the post office because that's what a government must do. We must support a judiciary, etc. But there are other things that people might say, I have no interest in your NPR, so why would you tax me to do it? If people like that sort of thing, there's a market system and they can buy it. And that's how it works. It doesn't work by advertising. It doesn't work by saying, let's now go to a 7-minute commercial segment of Ford, GM, and Tesla. It has an underwriting system where they deliberately limit the number of seconds that are used to show sponsorships and underwriting, and they give almost all of their time to the actual business of discourse, which is all things considered and so on.
I'm going to move on to another one. I'm afraid we're going to be accused of sending you softball nice letters this week, sir. But you deserve that. You've had a few rough weeks in the last month. This one comes from Andrew Zadnik, and he's an avid listener, he says, and appreciates the historical context and civil conversations. And he says he's been further enriched by the many books on America and natural history featured on the program, including American Sphinx, Rush, The First American, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers, American Serengeti, and also Repairing Jefferson's America by a certain humanities author. He has a few questions, and these I know you will enjoy. He says his family is planning a road trip in August to the Dakotas. From our home near Pittsburgh, our furthest destination will be Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The night before reaching the park, they'll be staying in Bismarck, with just about a half a day to explore the immediate area. I'd like to visit the approximate site of Fort Mandan. Are there any other nearby sites related to the Corps of Discovery that you'd recommend?
Well, first, I thought he was going to say he wanted to visit the barn, and you know how...
People know better than that.
But as to Lewis and Clark, the Lewis and Clark Fort Mandan Foundation has morphed into the Lewis and Clark State Park. It's at Washburn, which is about 43 miles north of Bismarck on US 83. It's one of the best Lewis and Clark interpretive centers in the country. I've been to every one of them, and this is an outstanding one. And I worked with the person who created it, David Borlaug, for a number of years. He's a friend of yours, too, friend of this program. And
great guy.
David Borlaug created this huge entity, and I was with him when we bought the Fisher Collection. The Fisher Collection by John Fisher out in Idaho was a very large set of artifacts that they're not authentic in that they weren't actually carried on the expedition, but they were the next best thing. They were contemporary matches. So the same books, the same editions of books, the same type of air gun, the same type of hatchets, the same, everything, the medicine kit, the tool kits, the surveyor's tools, and so on. John Fisher spent a fortune in a lifetime gathering up exact replicas, but authentic ones. And there's also a great bust, the Udon bust of Jefferson when you walk into the Lewis and Clark State Park Interpretive Center. So he should definitely go there. There isn't a lot more to really promote, I'm sorry to say, because wait a
minute. You and I have both been north of Fort Mandan. It's kind of hard to find in little roads. There is a marker up there near what they think was the actual location of the fort.
Yes, and I know where the actual location is, but that's a story still to be developed. Yes, you can go 14 miles west on gravel roads and find a cairn that was put up decades ago, which is about a mile from the actual site. But then also, if you go up to Williston, you have to go north and west of Fort Mandan along the north bank of the Missouri River. You can see some sites, including I have found the place where Lewis was shot on August 11th, 1806, by his own man, by Pierre Cruzat, in the buttocks. Not on purpose, it was an accident. But I've found that place called the Burnt Hills in one of my long excursions out into that country. But I was going to say that unfortunately, the Missouri River has been inundated through most of North Dakota by two great dams from the Pick-Sloan project. One is Garrison Dam, which was finished in 1953 and flooded out 210 miles, including the most precious farmlands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Native Americans, and then Oahe Dam a little bit later in South Dakota at Pier South Dakota flooded everything up to just south of Bismarck. And so that's Lakota land. And those native peoples were really damaged by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at this sort of high water mark of American industrialization during the 1950s and early 60s. So there isn't a lot of Lewis and Clark signage in North Dakota, and you can't really get to where they putatively had their campgrounds and so on. But if they want to go on to Montana, that state is absolutely rich in Lewis and Clark sites and signage.
He asks, are there any particular books on North Dakota cultural or natural history that you would recommend for the trip? He says, I understand Clay's book on North Dakota should be out by then, so I'll try to find a copy.
Yes, if he sends me $1,000, I'll send him an advance copy of the North Dakota book. It's called The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota. And then there's a book that I recommend by John Bloomley, Bluemle, John Bloomley, called North Dakota's Geologic Legacy, Our Land.
Great book. It's one of my wife's favorites.
And so that book is worth reading. It's always worth reading the WPA guidebooks. You know, the Work Progress Administration was an FDR alphabet soup agency that provided work for artists and writers and others. And they produced a WPA guide for each state. They've often been reprinted. North Dakota's has. And although they're dated in some significant ways, they also are very, very interesting. And so I would urge anyone who's interested in coming here to take a look at that volume too. But all jokes aside, my book on North Dakota, I'm actually, just before we started today, David, I was working on the galley proofs. So it's very close now. It'll be out in May. It's just agonizing to go through and see the cuts, the edits, the things you have to endure when you publish a book. But I'm happy with the process, and it's a better book, I'm sorry to say, for the editing protocols.
So Andrew, don't send him $1,000. Just watch for it. It'll be out.
You can still send the money, but if he's serious,
again, this
I'll
comes
get him a
from
copy.
Andrew Zadnik, and his last question in his letter is, what effect did the traditional role of women in various Native American communities have on those communities' interaction with the Corps? And were any of the communities considered matriarchal?
Lewis and Clark were carrying some cultural baggage. That should not surprise anyone. They were wearing a certain lens, and because they were wearing a certain lens, they saw what that lens can help them to see. So they believed that Native American women, and I'm using these terms cringingly, they considered them slaves or drudges. They said that the women did all the grunt work and the men sat around smoking and making war and hunting and so on. They misread these cultures pretty dramatically. How could they not? They were moving in and out, and they didn't have proper interpreters, so that they could only understand through sign language or through a very long telephone chain of very imperfect translators. But they got a lot wrong. They got a fair amount right, too. And they noticed, for example, that in most Native cultures on their tour, women owned the lodge and had considerable power over the private property, the immediate private property of their family. They were mostly trying to get across the continent as quickly as possible. And to the extent that they were dealing with Native peoples, about 51 of different tribes that they met, they were mostly explaining America's purposes and that they were there as explorers, not traders, but in their wake would come traders with all sorts of goods that would greatly improve the lives of the Native peoples that they were visiting. And would they like to send some representatives back to Washington to meet the Great Father and please live in peace with everybody, but particularly the United States, and so on. And so the ethnography was part of their mission, but it was something that had to be sacrificed to the greater imperatives of getting safely all the way to the Pacific coast and back again. So you take it from there, David. You know a lot about this.
I would like to, sir, but unfortunately it's time for us to take a short break. We can return to the subject or more mail in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the shameless self-promotional edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm seated virtually across from my friend David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Jefferson Hour. People know that you are the founder of Makoche Recording Studios, that in some ways it's called an Indian label. You've worked with a lot of Native Americans and musicians, and you've worked to help provide music for Ken Burns films and so on. So say what you know about how Lewis and Clark, or how the status of women in some of the tribes that Lewis and Clark met.
Well, I think you covered it very well, particularly saying that they misread it because they didn't really understand. And that's pretty easy to document their interactions with Native Americans, particularly their first encounter with the Lakota on the Missouri River in South Dakota. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, at the Bad River at Pierre, South Dakota.
But the Mandans in particular were a matriarchal society, and people don't realize to what extent the civilization had grown in those areas north of where you and I live, Clay. But I mean, at that time, the Mandan villages were the center of trade for multiple tribes every summer, and it is reported that the villages up there exceeded the size of St. Louis at that time.
Amazing. So I can tell this one little Jefferson story to sort of cap off this conversation. Jefferson wanted Native leaders to come back to Washington to meet him. And one of them, a man named Tooney, or Arkidar Narshar of the Arikara, which is just below the North Dakota-South Dakota border. Lewis and Clark talked this man, Tooney, into going back to Washington to meet the Great Father, to meet Jefferson. And he did. But he died while he was in the East. He died of natural causes somewhere near Washington, D.C. sometime in 1806. So this is a bad thing because, of course, the Arikara had sent one of their most respected people off on this mission, and he's not coming back, and they naturally are going to be concerned about what happened to him and was there any mischief and so on. So Jefferson wrote a letter to the Arikara that was sent up with others and eventually arrived at the mouth of the Grand River on the North Dakota-South Dakota border. And Jefferson said all the right things, that, that this man died of natural causes and we buried him with honors, and we understand that, that these things happen, and we hope that you understand that we treated him with great respect and honor and so on. But then Jefferson said, and by the way, I'm sending you some seeds so you can learn how to farm. Well, as you know, David, that's a ludicrous proposition. The Arikara had been farmers for 1,000 years or more. The Mandan, their friends, had 13 varieties of corn. They were great corn masters. They were geneticists who had developed 13 distinct varieties of corn. They had these huge underground silos, these cache pits, where they would have squashes and sunflowers and corn and beans and so on. And so for Jefferson to send seeds to the Arikara is like sending coal to Newcastle in England. This shows his greatness, of course. He believed in agriculture. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. But we were so ignorant of native ways that he could presume that they were just hunters and it was time for them to settle down and to begin to grow something. Well, they probably could have taught Jefferson more about gardening than Jefferson could ever have taught them.
I'm going to move on to another letter. This one comes from Ray Forrester. He writes, after the last episode, and he's talking about the Little Rebellion episode, I had to ask myself, why would Jefferson hold his beliefs about rebellion? The obvious answer is his reading of Locke and other political philosophy. In addition to that, I believe Jefferson, as an aristocrat himself, had to legitimize his rebellion against the aristocracy of England. Certainly both the Declaration and aristocracy was at the core of who Jefferson was.
Again, let me just quickly try to address this question because I puzzle over it all the time. So Jefferson is friendly to rebellions like Shays Rebellion in Western Massachusetts that was mostly peaceful, but not entirely. It involved some tarring and feathering and some bullying and some shooting, but it was not massive deaths. It wasn't the reign of terror in France. He's friendly to that. And John Adams would say, sure, easy to be friendly from Virginia or Paris. You weren't actually out there in Western Massachusetts at those courthouses and those farm auctions. So why is Jefferson friendly to them? I think he thinks, first of all, you want a citizenry that knows what's at stake. You want a citizenry that is very passionate and possessive of its rights, and when they feel that their rights and needs are not being met, that they will flare up in one way or another. They will get your attention. And he said they often will do these things through ignorance, not really understanding the situation well enough, but we shouldn't punish them too greatly. We should teach them. But their ignorance should not be used as a reason to automatically discredit them, because they're sort of a sign of the health of our republic, that people feel that strongly that they will take to the streets with their pitchforks and muskets when they feel that something really serious is at stake. And so if you take that sort of cluster of ideas, Jefferson, I think, might say that what happened on January 6th was terribly misguided, but it's a sign that there are people that still feel so strongly about American liberty that they are willing to flare up. And I think Jefferson would say there's more to learn by trying to understand their anxiety and their passion and their anger and their rage than there is to just dismiss this as the work of thugs. Of course you restore social order. Of course we can't allow the Capitol to be breached. At the same time, they're part of this deep American tradition that goes back to the Sons of Liberty and the Bostonians who threw the tea into the bay.
Let me go to another letter that'll reinforce your point. This one's from Dan Doherty. He says, when discussing the events of January 6th, I don't think you gave adequate consideration to Jefferson's thoughts on Shays Rebellion from his Tree of Liberty letter. Of Shays Rebellion, Jefferson wrote, I say nothing of its motives. They were founded in ignorance, not wickedness. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. Mr. Doherty goes on to say the motives of those who stormed the Capitol were diverse and, at the individual level, often multiple. But while some of the rebels were guided by wickedness, there were surely many who were motivated first and foremost by the belief that the election had been stolen from their preferred candidate.
I agree with that entirely, David. That's the point I'm making, and I think that's the correct reading of Jefferson, that the spirit of resistance is very valuable. And although it might be misapplied in this or that situation, as it was in Shays Rebellion, although more legitimate than what happened on January 6, 2021, Jefferson, I think, would say that we need that energy. Now we need to channelize it into something productive and useful for American civilization rather than ignorant mayhem. So the question all hangs on this. Do you or do you not believe that the election was stolen? If you believe that the election was stolen, if none of those 60-some court cases will convince you, if none of the investigations that have occurred so far will convince you, none of the certifications and the double audits and the second recounts will convince you, then there's not much more to talk about. But if you believe that the election was fundamentally fair, as the major figures of our culture have said, including Republicans, like William Barr, the former Attorney General, if you think that the election was fair, then they were certainly fundamentally, outrageously misguided to assault the Capitol on the principle that the election had been stolen. What's the remedy? Well, we're seeing the remedy. You arrest the ringleaders, especially those that did significant damage. You make it clear that this is an intolerable situation. You up your security regimen around the Capitol for as long as you need to do it. You make it abundantly clear that this would not disrupt the session. I think that Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi's going back and continuing the certification on that same day after the shortest possible interruption was exactly the right thing to do, saying we will not be intimidated. We will continue to do the lawful work of the United States Constitution, even on a day as horrific as this, because we must. We mustn't succumb to this sort of insurgency. So I think we've done every right thing. Now we need to do the Jeffersonian thing, and that is to say, how do we heal? How can we inform the insurgents so that they see that they were in error? How can we convince themselves and others that this was a fair election? How can we shore up our election protocols so that these sorts of ambiguities or irregularities or uncertainties don't happen the next round? Can we teach people better? Should we restore civics in our classrooms, etc.? So that's the key to it, David. The Jefferson position is these people might be wrong, but we have to try to figure out how to make this right without just condemning them as barbarians. That
I agree, and to that end, I have another letter that I was glad to get. It came from Christopher Leopold. His original letter said, "Have you seen the witnesses in many states that came forward with a lot of evidence into voter fraud, especially with electronic voting machines?" We had a back and forth, and he sent me, at least a half a dozen links to videos and articles about voter fraud. And I watched them, and I get it. If you watch these without any counterpoint, it's like, hey, this isn't right. They're stealing the election. I think it's important to understand that. I don't agree with it, but I think it's important to understand it.
Well, two things there. One is that let's just assume that those are not deliberately misrepresenting the situation in this or that state, that they're plausible explorations of irregularities. That may be so. I personally doubt it, but if it's so, we need to know that. And we then need to ask, would this have made any difference? Well, these things do happen. They happen in both directions. There will always be some limited irregularities in any election involving 300 million people. So we have to ask ourselves a question about weight and proportionality. And the second thing is, I do really honestly believe, I guess this is my most important point today, that we need a national blue ribbon commission of nonpartisan people to look into the 2020 election. Every state, every irregularity, all the film clips that you've been shown, all the allegations of evidence. We need to look at this with the same kind of energy that we looked at the 9/11 Commission. And we need to ask ourselves, A, how much was there and did it make a difference? That's the first question. Secondly, how can we fix this? What we're in now, David, is a confidence issue. There are X millions who believe that the election was stolen, and they may not be 100% on that conclusion, but they feel that there were irregularities and those irregularities have been covered up. The attitude of many is nothing happened. There's nothing there. So stop talking about it. I think that that's a mistake. I think that we need to really look into this with all of the apparatus of an advanced democratic culture, with the expertise that we have, and then be able to write a report for the American people. Now, not everyone will believe the report, but I'd rather have that than nothing.
Agreed. And I'm so glad that Christopher sent those links to me, because it helped me to understand. And lastly, sir, we have a letter here from a Mr. John Frank. He listens on WHRO, WHRV. And the subject of his email is biased moderator. He says, "I've been a loyal listener for at least a decade. No more. You've gone off the rails with your Trump hatred. I did not vote for him either time, yet I acknowledge some of his accomplishments. More disturbing is the left lurch taken by the Democrats after 2016. Your part-time, semi-permanent host, David, just opined that Fox News was more biased than MSNBC. That's ridiculous, with such non-journalists as Rachel Maddow et al. Spewing bigotry every night on MSNBC. Sean Hannity may know better, but to take sides in such an absurd debate only convinces me that David has no idea how to judge objective reporting. Goodbye and good luck." I wrote him back. I was hoping to engage him in some conversation, but I didn't get a response.
Well, they usually come back. I don't think that you're particularly biased. I think that to call Rachel Maddow bigoted is insane. Whatever else she is, she's one of the least bigoted people you will ever meet in the world. Her soul is filled with generosity. She wants to embrace everyone who is in this country. She believes that we're a multicultural democracy that's still pretending in some ways to be an Anglo-Saxon white republic. And I think that she's done enormously important work. And I do think that there's some bias in what she does. That's her brand. But I do not think that there's an ounce of bigotry. So I think that is an ill-chosen descriptor of her work. But I don't have any sense, David, that you are a hater of Trump. I think that what really upset us is the extra-constitutional attempt at a putsch, and the systematic violation of norms and the concatenation of lies, things like that. Those are things that are not necessarily partisan. They could have come from Huey Long on the other side of the political spectrum. They just happened to come this time from the Republican standard bearer, Donald Trump.
Well, just to cap this off, I am so glad that Mr. Frank took the time to write us with his criticism. I accept it. It made me think. I'm sorry he and I didn't have a chance to have more of a dialogue. And also, I mean, one does not have to look very hard to find bias in most all news reporting. It's a business, and they want to keep our attention in whatever way they can.
I'm so glad that this era seems to be ending. I didn't enjoy the last 18 months of talking about President Trump. It's not, I was queasy about the rebellion program. I'm even queasier about the fixation we've had to have. And I'll say this as we close today, that Donald Trump is the largest political figure of my lifetime, and that includes some giants like Ronald Reagan and LBJ and Jack Kennedy. He sucks more oxygen out of the nation's air than any other figure. He makes himself the center of more discourse than anyone who has ever been the president of the United States, at least in my lifetime. He became an indispensable daily subject of conversation. The outrage of the day, the tweet of the day, the scandal of the day, the pronouncement of the day, whatever it was, Trump occupied America in a way that no other figure has done. And it's amazing. And I credit him with having a huge, charismatic, disruptive dynamism, that this is something, that this is not a negligible figure. He's a huge figure in our national discourse, in our politics. But it's over now. That era, I hope, shall end, and we can return to something like a more casual, a more normal, a less volatile national discourse. And it's not that I want to talk about wine or gardening exclusively, but I want to use our time in a life-affirming way rather than in the reactive way that all of America was forced into by this extraordinary human being.
Very good, sir. Thanks for an enlightening conversation this week.
Hard work. I'm pleased with all of the responses we get, and I shall defend the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour against all of his detractors. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.